What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Wednesday, December 13th, 2017, middle of the weekday, hump day, starting that long, slow glide down to Powwow on a Friday. And we have got a lot of stuff to talk about today. All right, so let's get right on into the news here. Obviously, a lot of people are very disappointed at last night's Alabama election. Doug Jones has been declared the winner. Roy Moore isn't exactly conceding because already there are all these reports of problems, irregularities they're called, saying that it was a very close vote. And there seem to be some problems here. And, of course, the corporate media is out there saying, oh, this is an embarrassment for Donald Trump. It's a disaster for Republicans. It's all Bannon's fault. And basically commenting on the fact that Alabama tends to vote GOP, and this is its first Democratic senator since the early 1990s. But as I said before, there are already problems being reported. There are reports about write-in ballots being thrown out. Apparently there was some tampering there. A lot of people are claiming they never received their absentee ballots. And it's going to be impossible to see if anybody else diverted those absentee ballots and filled them out because due to that last-second decision by the Alabama State Supreme Court, the election records, the digital scans of the actual ballots are being destroyed. So, again, another dirty, crooked election, and nobody in government seems to want to do anything about it. And this should be a warning shot to Donald Trump that if his Commission on Election Integrity does not get its act together and start dealing with this problem, he's going to be a single-term president, and he's probably going to lose the Congress next year as well. And, of course, there was a miracle all over Alabama yesterday. The dead are rising from the grave, and apparently 9,210 dead people voted with absentee ballots and early voting. And apparently there were these so-called poll worker representatives going around nursing homes talking to patients who are basically mentally incapable of understanding politics, and apparently filling out absentee ballots for them. And there were the usual reports of machine glitches, polling places. There were long lines because the machines weren't working. And Alabama's trying to explain this away by saying, well, it's a whole brand new system, and, this was the shakedown cruise, and there were going to be problems. But Alabama has a long, long history of very questionable elections. And this just appears to be another one of them right now. Apparently, there were allegations of voter suppression. Apparently, people were added to the inactive voter list, even though they voted in the Senate primary. So, the usual skullduggery to the benefit of the Democrats. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the Democrats, according to the official Alabama election statistics, 92% of the Democrats in the state voted. That's unheard of in an off-year election. And people are already saying this can't be right. All right. Now, as you know, Rosenstein is getting his grilling in front of the Congressional Committee, and they're covering a lot of subjects, and Rosenstein is trying to defend all of the investigators, such as Peter Strzok, and saying that, it's normal for these investigators to have their own political opinions. We shouldn't fault them for that. But it doesn't necessarily suggest that they're biased in their investigation. Which is kind of a little bit silly when the entire investigation seems to be biased against Trump. Now, if half of them were biased against Trump and half of them for, then you'd have a case to say that bias is not coming on in there. Now, Rosenstein did confirm there have been no improper orders from the White House, but he also says there's no reason to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller at this time. Now, as it turns out, surprisingly, it looks like Mueller's investigation is about to wrap up anyway. He's finished interviewing the White House staff, and the word now is the investigation is going to be finished within a few weeks. And earlier it had been expected to go on for many more months. So what it's looking more and more like is, except for those indictments that have already been handed down, which were for activities unconnected to the campaign, Mueller found nothing. Mueller found nothing. Now, one of the real big stinks here that Rosenstein is trying to gloss over is the Department of Justice knew that Mueller had a conflict of interest related to the Russia probe before they even hired him. They issued what was called an ethics waiver, saying, yes, we know that there's a conflict, we're waiving this one, we don't think it's a problem, but on examination, the Justice Department refuses to disclose the details on just how they arrived at this decision that Mueller could have an ethics waiver over this Russia investigation. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network here. Now, federal judge, Washington, D.C., Tanya Chutkan, she's an Obama appointee. She's recused herself from a case involving a dispute over subpoenas issued for the Fusion GPS, the firm that commissioned that dodgy dossier. And apparently, Alexei Gubarev, who's a Russian technology executive accused in the dossier of hacking Democrat computer systems, has sought to subpoena Fusion GPS records and to depose its employees to find out more about the research firm's work on the dossier. Now, Chutkan recused herself last month from another case involving Fusion GPS. So it appears there may be some kind of a conflict of interest, or, as we mentioned the other day, the wife of that Department of Justice official who was demoted and taken off the investigation worked for Fusion GPS and the Central Intelligence Agency, which raised the question that Fusion GPS is, in fact, a CIA front. And maybe that's why the judge is being warned to get off that case. Now, getting on back to Peter Strzok, more and more questions are surfacing over his involvement in using that dodgy Russian dossier to get that FISA warrant to spy on Donald Trump's family. Because that would definitely indicate that crosses a line when you're out there obtaining a warrant using false pretenses. John McCain's role in this phony dossier is starting to be brought up again. Now, he's trying to talk it over and say this is no big deal. He wants this to go away. It's not going to go away because it's come on out that Senator John McCain was at least partially responsible for putting this dossier in the hands of the FBI. And it's a work of fiction. It was paid for by the Democratic National Committee, the Hillary Clinton campaign, and then later on by the FBI itself, and again, that links back to Peter Strzok. And then John McCain got hold of it, took it to the FBI, and when it was made public in BuzzFeed is when everybody else found out about this. Now, FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe has abruptly canceled his closed-door testimony in front of the House Intelligence Committee as news emerged that the wife of senior Department of Justice official Bruce Orr worked for Fusion GPS and CIA. And Orr was demoted last week after allegedly trying to conceal his contacts with Fusion. And all of a sudden, McCabe is saying, I don't want to testify. So it's looking like there's something else going on with Fusion. And again, if they are a CIA front, they're going to be trying to do damage control on this one as hard as they can. Now, Attorney General Jeff Sessions says he's exploring the idea of a special counsel for that demoted Department of Justice official who's tied to Fusion GPS and CIA. He's saying that. Whether it'll actually happen or not remains to be seen. But again, if Fusion GPS is tangled up with CIA, CIA is going to go all over Capitol Hill and say, no, this can't go any further. We don't talk about what the CIA does. We don't talk about the gun running. We don't talk about the drug running. We don't talk about any of that stuff. The public can't know what the CIA has been doing all these years. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start talking about the war zones because there's a lot of stuff going on over there. Trump has declared victory over ISIS in Syria. And this is arrogance on display. First of all, the reason the U.S. went into Syria was not to get ISIS, but to get Assad. And Assad is still there. And they had all that bogus stuff about Assad is gassing his own people, and Assad is tap dancing barefoot on shag carpeting, and Assad passes wind in the elevators, and all this other demonization that we hear every time the U.S. wants to go to war against another country. Then the U.S. rebranded, because the American people were getting sick of this war continuing in Syria, in what appeared to be an act of unbridled aggression. So they rebranded and said, well, we're actually in Syria to get ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And when the U.S. went in after ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they kept missing ISIS and Al-Qaeda and kept hitting important Syrian infrastructure. That's when Syria asked Russia to come on in, and Russia proved to be tremendously effective in getting rid of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And now Trump is trying to take credit for that. And then Trump comes out with another very arrogant statement. He's decided that he is willing to accept Assad staying in power until Syria's next election. Now, of course, given that the original agenda in Syria for the United States was to get rid of Assad, Trump just admitted that the U.S. effort to oust Assad has failed. Now, they may try and do something funny with Syria's elections, or they may just be standing around in Syria just so that they don't have to admit that they lost, even though everybody sees it as having been exactly that. And apparently the United States is still trying to find a way where they will participate in the post-conflict planning of Syria. And the United States is going to maintain their military assets on the ground after Russian forces exit, to ensure that U.S. officials are positioned to influence the post-conflict landscape. This is coming from former CIA officer Philip Giraldi. So even though they lost, they're still going to be in there and try and force their way in and say, yeah, we're going to help decide what the future of Syria will be. Good luck on that one, because nobody in Syria wants the U.S. meddling in their country any longer. They've had 6 years of U.S. meddling, and that's 5 years and 300 days way too long. Paul Craig Roberts is out there saying what we already know. Washington has lost the Syrian war, and by continuing to try and insert itself back into Syria, it may lose it a second time. And they're destroying their own credibility in the process. Now, Netanyahu is out there saying that Iran is thinking about sending 80,000 Shiite fighters into the Middle East, into Syria, to shore up Syrian entrenchment. Well, Syria is not entrenched. Syria is a nation. And what is going on here is, even though Netanyahu and Trump, and before Trump, Obama, messed up Syria, they're figuring out a way to blame Iran for it. No matter what goes wrong, we're going to blame Russia, we're going to blame Iran. And apparently Netanyahu is also still very angry at the EU foreign ministers over their refusal to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And he's accusing them of pampering the Palestinians. Says the Palestinians need a reality check. Now, apparently the Trump administration is preparing a public display of what it says is evidence that Iran is providing missiles to Houthi rebels in Yemen. And apparently Nikki Haley's going to go on up to the United Nations and present whatever they're going to show. And this is probably going to remind a lot of people of Colin Powell and his little vial of talcum powder that he told everybody was anthrax. Now, the missiles that have actually flown out of Yemen into Saudi Arabia are known to be a Yemen-designed, Yemen-built missile. Iran is denying sending them any missiles whatsoever, and there's a certain logistical reality that Iran would have a very tough time getting into Yemen through all the intervening territory with any sizable cargo planes. But apparently this is another attempt to demonize Iran ahead of a new war that they're planning for there. Speaking of Yemen, all the Russian diplomatic staff are leaving Yemen. They're going to try and do their functions in Riyadh, but basically they're saying that the situation in Sana'a is too unstable, and they're feeling that their diplomatic personnel are at risk here. Up in Ukraine, Kiev is claiming environmental damage in Crimea, that the Russians are damaging the Crimean environment, and therefore there have to be even more sanctions against Russia. Well, what about the environmental damage that Poroshenko is doing over in eastern Ukraine with the constant warfare? I think that's very damaging to the environment, so maybe it's time to put sanctions on Ukraine or on Poroshenko. But Poroshenko's got to be getting desperate to use environmentalism to try and push forward more hostilities against Russia. It really is rather silly. Now, the other day we were talking about how Russia and Japan are starting to move closer together militarily, with the first move being a joint search and rescue partnership, so that if something goes missing from either country, both countries will cooperate in trying to locate survivors. Meanwhile, friction is building between Japan and the U.S. because there's been another incident down in Okinawa. Now, the Okinawans want the U.S. out. Been there for a very long time. There's been an ongoing problem with U.S. forces raping Okinawan women and other issues. And apparently, there was a U.S. CH-53E transport helicopter flying over an elementary school on Okinawa, and one of the windows fell out onto the playground. And a 10-year-old boy suffered a minor injury, but it's once again reminded the people of Okinawa that this very heavy military equipment constantly flying overhead is a danger. They're worried about their safety from all these bits and pieces flying off U.S. aircraft. Now, over in Korea, things are getting a little bit confusing here, because yesterday, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the U.S. is ready to speak with North Korea at any time and without preconditions. Says we can talk about the weather if you want, we can talk whether it's going to be a square table or a round table, whatever. At least let's sit down and see each other face to face. Now, North Korea's been calling for talks all along, but the policy up until now was, from the U.S., talks are pointless. North Korea just does what we tell it to do, or there'll be consequences. So a lot of people were very surprised by Rex Tillerson's comment, and North Korea was quick to respond, saying, yes, it's important to avoid war. Our door is open for negotiations. Let's get this thing going. And everybody was saying, ooh, maybe we're going to dodge a bullet there in North Korea. Maybe we're going to back off on that one. Unfortunately, the White House then issued their statement saying that President Trump's policies regarding North Korea have not changed one bit, that North Korea continues to be a threat for everybody in the region. In other words, going on back to this confrontational attitude. Now, Trump right now is standing alone in his recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Maybe Trump thought he was going to be a new Harry Truman and get the world to just go along with what Israel wanted. It didn't work out that way. When we come on back from this commercial break, more on this subject. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and it's time to grab your paper and pencil. And I'm sure most of you have probably written this down already, but for those who have not, if you want to support our work, and we do need your support, the address to send a donation by check or money order is Republic Broadcasting Network, 2251 Double Creek Drive, number 302, Round Rock, Texas, 78664. And the phone number, if you want to call on in, is area code 800-724-2719, extension 01. So thank you in advance for all your help, because we certainly need it, especially as the nation is not getting any better as far as we can see. All right, getting on back to what's going on with Donald Trump and Jerusalem. Trump is basically standing all alone on this. I mean, Netanyahu is out there saying, yes, this is a good thing, everybody needs to go along, but Trump really is standing alone. Even the U.S. State Department is not changing its view that Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel. And so it looks like this was a totally empty, pointless, symbolic gesture that Trump did that has resulted in this furious backlash across the globe, ended any illusion that the United States was an impartial broker of peace in the Middle East. It's seriously damaged political relations with so many nations, nations that we're dependent on, nations that we need to be friends with. And all to please Netanyahu and AIPAC and Sheldon Adelson. Now, the Islamic Summit has come together, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation held an extraordinary summit to respond to President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And what they came up with is they officially recognize East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. And again, there's a significant difference in the approach to the city between Israel and Palestine. Palestine's willing to share. East Jerusalem is supposed to be Palestinian territory under the United Nations partition plan. And they're willing to let Israel have the part of Jerusalem that the United Nations says belongs to Israel for their capital. There's no reason you can't have a single city that's divided down the middle be a capital for both countries. And Palestine's willing to share. Israel is not. They want it all. Now, over in Egypt, their foreign minister, Sameh Shoukry, said before that meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that Egypt will remain at the forefront in defending historic and legal Palestinian rights. So that's very, very tough talk that's coming on out there. Jordan's king has rejected the change in the status of Jerusalem and its holy sites. Now, over in Malaysia, they're condemning and rejecting the U.S. move to proclaim Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, calling for it ultimately to be the capital of Palestine. And as we mentioned yesterday, there are tensions all over the place here. And apparently one of the political parties in Malaysia has launched a boycott campaign against Israeli products and enterprises as a form of protest. And they're simply saying nobody will use Israeli products in Malaysia from that point on. Now, I don't know how much Israel exports to Malaysia, but this is going to be another major hit on Israel's economy, along with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, commenting on the fact that Washington has lost the illusion of being an honest broker in the Middle East, says it's time for the United Nations to take over and settle the issue between Israel and Palestine. And of course, I can already see Nikki Haley jumping up and down and screaming, the United Nations is unfair to Israel. They're unfair to Israel. Now, here's a good one. Over in Iran, a member of the Iranian parliament says President Trump has opened a new chapter in the book of obscenity by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of the Israeli regime. And here's the kicker. This particular representative in the Iranian parliament is Jewish. That's another reminder about this nonsense that Netanyahu is out there saying that Iran is the new Nazi power and they want to exterminate the Jews. There are Jews serving in the government of Iran. And one of them says that this issue of Jerusalem was wrong, was just flat out wrong. Now, Iran's President Rouhani, speaking at that OIC summit, basically said Muslim nations have to set aside their differences for a unified defense of Jerusalem and the Palestinian cause. And Iran is ready to unconditionally cooperate in defending Jerusalem. So Donald Trump has inadvertently united the entire Muslim world against Israel and the United States. It was always a part of the world I wanted to visit. It's on my bucket list. Not anymore. I have a feeling they're not going to like Americans too much for a long, long time. Down in the African Union, senior human rights expert Salah Hamad said Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine and the United States cannot give it to Israel or any other party. And he's absolutely correct. Donald Trump is not master of the world. He doesn't have the authority to give Jerusalem to Israel. Now, Hamas has announced the beginning of the third intifada following Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and Israel responded immediately with airstrikes into Gaza. So the bombs are already flying over this. A lot of dead people. And the blood is on the hands of Donald Trump. We're going to take another phone call here. Aloha, Steve. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Steve, down Florida. I'm going to give you my little take on this whole Jerusalem thing is that to infuriate the Palestinians, you understand that Israel cannot steal land during peaceful times. So I think the whole goal is to infuriate that area there in order to have them riot and protest. Therefore, Israel will, of course, bring in the tanks, push them back further, seize land, and never give it back. I think this is kind of their goal.
Well, it may be part of the plan that's going on. The problem is that Israel is stealing land in peacetime. Those illegal settlements all over the West Bank. That's basically the theft of the land. And Israel routinely will commandeer Palestinian land supposedly for military purposes. And under international law, when the military purpose is over, they're supposed to give it back to the Palestinians. But instead it's turned over for development. For Israeli companies to develop. And so Israel is stealing the land even in peacetime. But yeah, Israel probably wanted to provoke the Palestinians into doing something so that they could go in and start dropping the bombs again, as they are doing right now in Gaza.
We should probably also be looking for some missiles to be going over to the Israelis, as they do that once in a while, shell their own people, their own areas. Nobody ever really gets hit, but shelling their own areas and, of course, placing blame on the Palestinians and, of course, rushing in with the tanks. Like I said, I think this is a little ploy they have. It's easier to steal land in times of conflict than in peacetime. They'll have reason to do these things, and they'll get acceptance for that. I don't accept it.
I question that because they lost the public relations battle on this one. Now, if world leaders had gone along with Trump and said, yeah, it's time to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and then the Palestinians rioted, everyone would say, oh, well, the Palestinians are in the wrong here. But pretty much the entire world is saying it's Donald Trump who's in the wrong here. And so every time Israel goes on in and bombs Gaza, the world will condemn it. Israel just doesn't care. They really have no respect for any other country except their own.
Hey, last question for you. I do believe the United States is acting like the bully in the schoolyard. They have been for a long time. I mean, is it possible, will we ever see other countries realizing that they're getting picked off one by one and finally come to the agreement, we can't lick them by ourselves, but let's all get together and collaborate, and let's kick this schoolboy's ass in the schoolyard. I see as that's how our country is. It's the bully in the schoolyard. Is it going to happen? Will other countries finally realize that one by one they're getting picked off and they'll unite against the United States? Will that happen?
Well, I'm sure they already realize that's the U.S. agenda, is to pick off these countries one by one. I think they're trying to hold off on this idea of uniting and going to outright war out of fear of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. But at the same time, they're probably also looking at what's going on inside our country and have concluded, as I have, that the nation is actually very weak internally, economically, militarily, and could be facing a Soviet Union-style collapse in the very near future. So they're going to just sit back and basically wait for that to happen. But if that does not happen, then yes, at some point, we're probably going to see a coalition of nations form around China and Russia, who also have nuclear weapons, and they'll say, yeah, it's time to basically slap down this bully.
Would that happen? You think that could happen as an economic war or an outright conventional war type situation? Economic first?
Well, there's already economic war going on all over the planet, led by the U.S. with all these sanctions, and now these other countries are trying to sanction back. And my concern right now is that these Middle Eastern nations are going to unite together and declare an oil embargo against the West. And as I mentioned yesterday, they already have major oil shortages in Britain and Europe because of that Austria oil hub explosion and the closing of one of the North Sea pipelines for repairs. This would be a real good time to do that. But unfortunately, economic wars have a bad habit of turning into real wars. And I think our government really does want a real war with these other countries for a variety of reasons, mostly because they can't rally patriotic support of the American people over what amounts to banking transfers. Economic war doesn't fire the human imagination the way a real war does.
Hey, thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go. The fun back to that OIC summit. Basically, Erdogan got up there and said that Trump has basically rewarded Israel for its constant terrorist acts by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So it really has turned into an ugly, ugly situation. I don't think this was what Trump thought was going to happen. And by the way, have you noticed on the corporate media, no more reporting about it? Right now, the entire focus here, they're still going over, you know, huzzah, huzzah, the Democrats prevailed in Alabama, mixed in with the tax plan and how it has to get passed real quick. But there's been no more talk about the world reaction to Trump's decision about Jerusalem, because it's all negative. It's all negative. Now, over in Turkey, speaking of Erdogan, do you remember back in 2016, there was a failed coup d'etat against Erdogan's government. And apparently a wealthy ally of Erdogan has placed a bounty on the heads of 2 former U.S. military and intelligence officials as part of what U.S. officials told the Free Beacon is an effort by the Turkish government to threaten and intimidate Americans who they think were working to undermine Erdogan. So the bounties are about $800,000 placed on the heads of former Pentagon official Michael Rubin and former top CIA official Graham Fuller. And Turkey says they were involved in that coup d'etat. And that's a big reason why Turkey is pivoting away from the United States. You don't mess with other people's country without a consequence. Now then, Tillerson, while I admire what he was saying about North Korea, he's back to ranting about Russia, and he's still out there pushing this idea that Russia meddled in last year's election, even though no evidence has surfaced of that at all. And Tillerson has declared it to be hybrid warfare. So they're trying to find a way to convince the United States that we have already been attacked by Russia. See, it's very important when the U.S. starts a war. They need to make it look like the other guy started it first, because Americans aren't comfortable with the idea of being aggressors. So this is basically Tillerson out there saying, well, Russia sort of kind of has already declared war on us because they meddled with the election. And again, zero evidence to support it. This is the updated version of Saddam has nuclear weapons, or Assad is gassing his own people. Now, as you know, Donald Trump signed this $700 billion military budget, but analysts are saying that when you add in other spending that benefits the military, black projects, other ancillary spending that's not actually on the official defense budget, the actual money that is going to be spent on defense is over $1 trillion. It's a huge amount of money to go on out and conquer the world. But again, as I've mentioned before, the United States spends more on the machinery of war than the next 25 nations put together, most of whom are supposed to be our friends. But they spend it so wastefully on weapons that cost huge amounts of money and do not work that it would be folly to assume that simply because we're spending more money makes us invincible. Because it doesn't really. And it's a dangerous idea to think that it does. We saw how well Russia's weapons worked over Syria. We saw how poorly America's weapons worked when Donald Trump sent that cruise missile attack hit that Syrian airbase, following an unsubstantiated, never proven claim that Assad was gassing his own people again. Now, Trump may have believed that was what was going on because that was what the CIA was saying, but we know the CIA was lying. The CIA is hardly truthful when they talk to politicians. That's part of their job, to lie, to do what CIA thinks is best for the country, because they're out of control. They're running the show, not Donald Trump. We're going to take another break here for commercials, and we're going to come on back with more news. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And I have to be very honest, I am getting totally burned out on all this sexual assault allegations. And as I said before, yes, a lot of this stuff really happens. On the other hand, some of these allegations are completely fabricated, as we saw in the case of Roy Moore, for political gain, for revenge, for publicity. Apparently, Selma Hayek, years after it all happened, has now come out claiming that Harvey Weinstein forced her to do a nude lesbian sex scene in a movie that she was in, or he said he would refuse to distribute it. So one of the problems I have are all these women who are claiming these incidents happened years and years and years ago, and they never did anything about it. They never told their friends and family. And then all of a sudden, in the current hysterical climate, everybody's coming forward with hashtag #MeToo and, oh, these horrible things happened to me. Feel sorry for me. Give me my 15 minutes of media fame. And so forth. But unfortunately, it apparently is a very powerful smear tool, and nothing new about that. There's an old story about President Lyndon Johnson, when he was earlier on in his political career, was running for office, and put out a story that his opponent was having carnal knowledge of farm animals, and one of his advisors said, you can't say that. You can't actually come out and say that. And Johnson said, yeah, but I can force him to deny it, which is almost as good. So we are hearing that apparently the Democrats, the liberals, are getting ready to mount yet another smear campaign against Donald Trump, this one focusing on allegations of sexual assault. And again, money is changing hands on this. Gloria Allred is getting involved. Now, Bill O'Reilly, who was forced from his previous position at Fox News over sexual abuse allegations, and we're not going to say whether they're true or not, because I don't know. I've never met the man here. But it has transformed him into a crusader on this issue. And apparently, Bill O'Reilly had an appearance on Glenn Beck's radio program. And according to O'Reilly, his team of investigators have uncovered a tape in which a lawyer offers a woman $200,000 to accuse Donald Trump of untoward behavior. And Bill O'Reilly went on to say that they're encouraging this person who has the tape to hand it over to the U.S. attorney because the investigative team believes there are 3 separate crimes on the audio tape, along with getting the lawyer involved disbarred. And O'Reilly said that if necessary, he'll release the tape himself, that he'll go to the U.S. attorney. He doesn't want to do that and put himself into the story. But as a citizen, he feels it's necessary to get this done. And if that was documented, and he's got the tape, that might pull the rug out from all of this nonsense about sexual assault allegations. We're going to take a break for station identification. We'll be back after these few words. Aloha America, welcome back to our show, hour number 2. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. Now, everybody is looking at the cryptocurrencies and they're skyrocketing, and people are saying, oh, we're all getting rich, and I guess some are. But we're already hearing people come on out and saying they're at the top and now's the time to start profit taking. And I think that may be the trigger for a major drop because, again, there is nothing supporting the value of cryptocurrencies. It is all based on demand. And if people start selling off their bitcoins, there will be a drop in the price. Adding to the confusion, apparently 2 major cryptocurrency exchanges have suffered outages. Cryptocurrency exchange operators Coinbase and Bitfinex have been experiencing technical problems. At one point yesterday, Coinbase said service unavailable, saying it was down for maintenance, maybe, or maybe it was being hacked. Those Bitcoin exchanges, there's a lot of virtual money in there. Remember the exchange for Bitcoin miners got hit a week ago, and somebody made off with huge amounts of Bitcoins. If they dump them all on the market all at once, that could also cause a major drop. And remember, we also reported yesterday that basically this group of 1,000 people own 40% of all the available Bitcoins. So they're hoarding it, which may indicate manipulation is coming on. So a little bit of problems there. Now, as you know, out in California, they're having these horrific wildfires. They're claiming to be 25% contained, but it's huge amounts of damage. 250,000 acres burned, thousands of structures damaged or destroyed. And the new GOP tax bill will eliminate critical deductions for disaster victims. Talk about bad timing. And apparently the hardest hit of the people in the California fires may not be eligible for the support that they got earlier, where when you had to replace your property and your insurance wouldn't cover it all, you could deduct those losses off of your income taxes, but apparently that's being cut as well. So the only ones getting tax cuts are the wealthy and the corporations, and for everybody else, it's the deductions that are being cut. We talked the other day about how school teachers who use their own money to buy school supplies for their classes, they're not going to be able to deduct that either. This GOP tax bill is a raw deal, no question about it. All right, let's go over and talk about Europe, and specifically about Great Britain. Apparently, the Brexit deal has hit some major potholes. And Theresa May is caught between a rock and a hard place because she's trying to give the European Union what the European Union wants to let Britain go. But her own supporters and people are saying she's already given them too much. Why should there be a divorce payment? Just go. And Nigel Farage is blasting Theresa May for giving into the demands of the European Union during the Brexit negotiations. And there have been some very harsh words going on. And apparently, Guy Verhofstadt has blasted David Davis for unacceptable remarks that undermine trust between London and Brussels by revealing that Britain's Brexit deal is not legally binding. He says it's more a statement of intent. So apparently, in response, a German member of the European Parliament is saying the current Brexit trade talks could be completely ditched, that everything is off the table, back to square one. And meanwhile, Guy Verhofstadt is raging at Britain, saying, why would you want to leave? Why don't you like your slave chains? Why would you even want to leave? Now, at this point, I think it would be appropriate for Britain to just leave. Throw some gates on the Channel Tunnel and leave. The sticking point is that the European Union is threatening Britain with a trade embargo unless they get this huge divorce payment, which is basically designed to allow the European Union to keep siphoning wealth out of Great Britain to prop up the EU, even after Britain is gone. Now, I remember early on, Donald Trump was talking about enhancing trade between Great Britain and the United States to try and offset that, but I haven't heard anything coming out of the White House about that lately. But obviously Britain does a lot of trade with Europe, and they need to reestablish new trade agreements, and Brussels is saying that Britain cannot negotiate new trade agreements while they're still part of the EU. It's a catch-22. So if Great Britain decides to do a hard Brexit and just go, there is going to be 2-3 months before they can get the trade started back up again. And that's going to be very, very difficult to do, especially in the dead of winter. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Now, apparently, speaking of the EU, Jean-Claude Juncker is reportedly involved in a criminal investigation about claims that tampering with evidence misled an inquiry into phone tapping. So Juncker is now in trouble as well. That may keep him occupied. Meanwhile, down in Paris, the Parisians are fed up with this migrant situation and the migrant camps, and they're angry about hundreds of migrants sleeping on the streets, basically filling the streets with long lines, waiting for their asylum requests to be processed. And some Parisians are saying they're going to go on a citywide hunger strike if these street camps are not removed, because apparently these migrants are just defecating and urinating right on the ground, and it's flowing out into the streets. There's apparently a state of constant rioting going on over the frustration and rage. So this open borders thing just has not worked out. And I think there's one of two situations that apply. Either the people who were pushing for open borders simply did not think about what the possible negative repercussions were going to be, or they simply did not care that urine in the streets is a small price to pay for the globalist New World Order and the nationless planet. If you look at what's going on in places like Sweden, Europe is already being destroyed. Europe, as we used to know it before all this globalism, has seriously changed. It's very different today. I got an email from somebody talking about how I speak glowingly of Germany from when I worked there. Same thing for Italy. But that was back in the 1980s. And I think, based on what we're seeing in the media, that Germany and Italy that I knew back then doesn't exist any longer. And that is a tremendous loss. And one of the things I don't like about this idea of multiculturalism is there's an implicit demand in there that your own culture be de-emphasized as all these other cultures are brought on in and don't really want to assimilate any longer. Now, up in Denmark, there's a school that has come under serious criticism because normally every year the school will have a Christmas pageant. Now, they don't really do that here in the U.S. because of the separation of church and state, but it used to happen. Some schools had it. Even Charlie Brown Christmas had one. But apparently it's very common in Europe, or certainly in Denmark. But apparently this one primary school decided to cancel their traditional Christmas pageant so that it wouldn't offend students of immigrant backgrounds. And I think this is a good example of what I mean, where multiculturalism implicitly says your own culture has to be de-emphasized. And I think that's completely wrong. I think when immigrants come to this country and they want to bring their own culture with them, that's fine. And nobody's going to say, you know, you can't do your culture in your own home, your own communities. But this idea that the existing indigenous culture has to go away, that's rude. Teddy Roosevelt had the right idea. He said, if you're an immigrant, you want to come to this country, you are welcome. I'm paraphrasing here. But you need to understand, this is the United States of America. It's not the country you came from. We have one language, English. We have our own sets of laws. And that is the country that you're moving into. And through most of the heyday of immigration, Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, and so forth, that was how immigrants would behave. They'd come to this country. They'd have their own culture and language in their home, but when they were out on the streets, they understood. There were laws of this land that had to be obeyed. That if you wanted to communicate with a lot of people, you would have to learn English, and you'd have to integrate into our culture. But for some reason, during this current fury over globalism and nationalism, the attitude seems to be send enough people into another country and turn it back into the country you just left. And my response to that all the time is, well, if the country you just left was all that good, why are you here? So anyway, this school, located in Grested, basically canceled the Christmas pageant and said the reason they did that is because they have students who are not Protestant. And they didn't want to come across that they were preaching to these kids. Now, again, when you have separation of church and state, I would tend to agree with that. But in this case, this appears to be a decision that's made in the name of political correctness. We can't say certain things. Remember when they were trying to tell us, you can't say Merry Christmas because there are people around you who find it offensive. Well, I'm back to saying Merry Christmas this year. And if you're offended, too bad. I don't care. I don't care anymore. You can't have freedom of expression, which includes saying Merry Christmas, without offending somebody. You can't make everybody happy. Why try? Now, do you remember the big stink that they kicked up when the accusation was made that Russia interfered with the Brexit vote? It was Russia's fault that the Brexit vote passed, that Russia had flooded Britain with ads and propaganda to urge the breakup of the European Union, to weaken the EU. And so apparently the Electoral Commission asked Facebook to basically collect together all the information on Russia's meddling in the 2016 referendum. And Facebook said, yeah, and they went in and they looked at the accounts. They found 3 ads. 3. 1, 2, 3 Russian Brexit ads. They cost less than $1 in total and reached no more than 200 viewers over a period of 4 days. So, no, Russia did not force the Brexit. Once again, they're being blamed for things they didn't do. Getting on back to Baltimore, and boy, they seem to have some serious problems there with that dead detective. And apparently there was another killing not too long ago, and yes, it was of another witness. And apparently 4 men in Baltimore have been charged in the killing of this witness who was going to testify against one of their associates in an attempted murder trial. And apparently this witness, Melvin Ford, was shot twice in the head at point-blank range in what it looked like was a targeted execution. And apparently they were able to identify the shooters because somebody got very careless with their discussions and they were overheard. It's amazing. Now, the FBI is launching a probe into Planned Parenthood for organ trafficking, which is illegal. And you have to look at what Planned Parenthood has been doing with the aborted fetuses, harvesting the organs and selling them. That's organ trafficking. And Planned Parenthood's defenders are saying, well, remember, a fetus is not really a human being, therefore it's not organ trafficking. And apparently the FBI is taking a slightly different view, one that I agree with. And again, I don't think anybody has a right to say when human life begins, especially when you're talking about late-term abortions where the fetus could actually, theoretically, survive with the adequate medical care. Now, down in Indonesia, they're having an outbreak of diphtheria, and it's apparently very frightening to civilians and government officials. And of course, the response is, "Well, you need a vaccine. We're going to have vaccination here." And apparently, the bacteria that causes diphtheria ravages the human body. It causes a thick covering in the back of the throat, and it's infected hundreds in Indonesia. The disease is spreading quickly, and not only to regions with limited health services, but also to the country's capital, Jakarta. Now, I remember when I was a kid, diphtheria was still a concern here in this country, but it was eradicated. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be brought back with the open borders. We've already seen that in this country. Diseases that had been eradicated by the U.S. health system are being reintroduced by the people coming across the border because they're not going through medical checks. Even back during the heyday of U.S. immigration, there was a health check at Ellis Island, and if you were sick, you were either placed in quarantine until you got well, or you were sent back home. These days, just wide open, not to mention the people who are simply walking across the border from Mexico. We've had cases of bubonic plague show up here, along with HIV, scabies, H1N1. There's been another outbreak of Ebola in Africa. What if somebody walks into the United States carrying the Ebola virus? Now, here's a story. This is about chemotherapy. We've been talking about chemotherapy and radiation treatment for cancer. They're big money makers. And they're not cures. They're treatments. And yes, you can go into remission from the chemotherapy and the radiation, but the cancer always seems to come on back. And apparently there's been a new study that is explaining why. Because what they're discovering is that chemotherapy, in attacking the cancerous tumors, will cause tumor cells to break off, still living tumor cells to break off and circulate in the blood, spreading it to other areas of the body. In other words, the chemotherapy is causing the metastasization of cancer. Now, let's talk a little bit about net neutrality, which it is apparent that's about to go away. And a lot of people are very angry about that because our lives center on the Internet for many of us. Not just radio broadcasters, but people at their work, people running businesses. They need that Internet, and they need a free and open Internet. And everyone presumed, and the policy was up until recently, that the common carrier provisions of the telephone company breakup applied to the Internet. That it basically functions as a public utility, and it ought to be treated as a public utility. But that is about to change. And the FCC is about to give the giant Internet service providers the power to divide the Internet and basically turn it into a commercial content delivery system and sideline everybody else. Now, when we come on back, a little explanation for why this has sailed on through. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And once again, if you want to support Republic Broadcasting, the address is Republic Broadcasting Network, 2251 Double Creek Drive, number 302, Round Rock, Texas, 78664. Or you can do it over the phone at 800-724-2719, extension 01. Now then, getting on back to the ISPs and the loss of net neutrality. It turns out that the major ISP companies have been very, very generous with our politicians. And there was an article that came on out from TheVerge.com where basically ISPs donated a total of $101 million to current sitting members of Congress. And basically everybody was on the take. Just about everybody in the Senate, everybody in the House of Representatives got their share. Some got more than others. And that was why they basically bought net neutrality out from under us. Okay, I got an email from somebody correcting me on the situation in Alabama. Apparently, ID is required at the polling places. Obviously, that doesn't apply to people who vote absentee ballot. We have a caller on the line here, Curtis in Nevada. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, Mike, you know, I mean, anybody that's watching knows when these long-term propaganda type things are coming. We saw it when they did it with the Black Lives Matter thing. But the problem was with that population, it was successful, but they only had like about 17% of the population to work with. But unfortunately, in this thing with harassment, you've got 50% plus of the population, and half of that is already on board. So what happens is when you overload the system with all these allegations, you don't need to prove anything. You just have to get that 5 or 10% or maybe 5% at the most of the women that are going to. They're not going to go beyond just the superficial, they're not going to look into it. They're not going to hold judgment. They're going to go by emotion because, unfortunately, that's human nature. We've known that, and that's what they were able to pull off. And so now we have a situation where, one half of the population rules just by, short-term emotion. And they're going to use that. It's going to be a winner for as long as, who knows?
Well, again, part of the problem goes back to the militant feminist movement of the 1990s and continues to today. Not quite as severe, but back in the 1990s, the message going out from the feminist leaders to women were that all men were rapists and all men were abusive and all men were pigs and blah, 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 blah. And so when women today are hearing about somebody sexually assaulted this woman, it's basically confirmation of their existing belief structure. And that's why they'll just sort of go along with it, without question. And again, it has built this system where, unfortunately, these sexual allegations, sexual abuse allegations, do work, and people aren't being as critical about it as they should. And as I keep saying, some of the allegations are true, no question about it. I saw a lot of it when I worked in Hollywood. But we also know a lot of these allegations are false for political gain or a fleeting moment of fame, extorting hush money, what all else. But you're right. Unfortunately, too many people uncritically accept these allegations.
Well, once again, I hate to keep bringing this point up, but the fault lies every time I hear a man saying, well, I let the little lady handle it. She's in charge of the household. I'm just going to sit back and watch. When I hear that, I hear a guy says, are you getting married? Do you realize that when you get married, you think it's going to change where you're going to all of a sudden take charge? It's just going to get worse. And 4 or 5 years down the road, it's become acceptable now that she has an out option. That before it used to be a lifetime commitment for both. And that's how you viewed, relations between men and women. But nowadays, if things aren't going well 4 or 5 years down the road, don't be surprised if you find out, because 7 out of 10 divorces filed by women, and she's already got 2 or 3 accounts already set up just in case. See, it's a long-term, short-term, mid-term kind of looking down the road, and if things aren't working out here, she's setting herself up. And you're the one that's going to be paying for everything. You're the one that's going to be responsible for the failure of that marriage, and the men in general are going to be responsible for the failure in this country and Western society, and that's history. That's what's going to happen. And all these idiots that think that they're doing the right thing by letting it happen, the men are going to be ultimately responsible.
Well, I'm not sure that I would go as far as to say the men are responsible. I think by virtue of the fact that they're accepting these allegations uncritically, women bear part of the responsibility as well. Anyway, listen, Curtis, I'm going to have to let you go. We got to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back. And we're going to get to some other stories here. Now then, getting on back to the loss of net neutrality, it turns out, according to an article over in governmentslaves.info, more than 100 million Americans can only get Internet service from companies that have already violated net neutrality. And the issue with net neutrality is it's good in principle, but it wasn't really being enforced. And a lot of companies started biasing their traffic toward their big corporate customers at the expense of the little people. And as I said out here in Hawaii, Spectrum Internet is terrible service. And it's another reason why we should be opposing monopolistic control of the Internet. There used to be laws against monopolies because competition would lower prices and raise quality of products and services. Now we have these huge monopolies who, once they are monopolies, can say, we can charge whatever we want because you can't go anywhere else, and forget about complaining about the service. You're lucky you're getting any service at all. And we pay for 300 megabits per second download speed, and we're only getting about 60. And Spectrum was actually sued by the state of New York for failing to deliver the traffic that they advertise. So let's get on out here and talk about the most damaging hacks of this year, because they were out there. There was the WannaCry crypto worm, and it was ransomware, and it was very, very damaging. Thousands of organizations, including FedEx, Britain's National Health Service, Telecoms, Telefonica, and Megaphone, others were affected. And then there was Petya, followed by NotPetya. It's actually surfaced in 2016, but the 2017 version, identified as NotPetya, was used to target organizations in Ukraine, and apparently was propagated through the software update mechanism of the accounting software Medoc. And then there was the Equifax break-in that affected millions of people and exposed their information. All right, let's see. We're going to take another phone call. Chris in St. Petersburg, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, the doctor who you just mentioned, the surgeon, who's the 81st doctor found dead under suspicious circumstances, Dr. Dean Lorick, that Aaron Elizabeth so conscientiously has been reporting on all these doctors since June 2015 having died under suspicious circumstances. And this Dr. Dean Lorick had complained, and you can read Aaron's reportage at healthnutnews.com. Dr. Lorick had complained on CNN's website about the deplorable situation that the Clinton fund, what do you call it? The Clinton Foundation. See, I'm not a acolyte of Trump or Clinton or anybody. It's just these doctors are being apparently murdered under very suspicious circumstances. So, see, on CNN's website, he writes, quote, "We expected many amputations, but we thought we could save limbs that were salvageable, particularly those of children. We recognize that in an underdeveloped country, a limb amputation may be a death sentence. It does not have to be so. We thought our plan was a good one, but we soon learned we were incredibly naive. Disaster management in Haiti was non-existent." And he goes on, but it's interesting that this is the 81st doctor dead under suspicious circumstances. The 79th doctor, Dr. Crespo, was also a professor at Weill Cornell Medical College, as was Dr. Lorick. Dr. Crespo was found dead in a bathroom there. And when it comes to Dr. Lorick, he was found by his 11-year-old daughter.
Yes.
Unfortunately, did not leave a suicide note. You would think that being a surgeon, he would have known to, if he was going to stab himself, do so in the heart rather than in the torso. He had drugs available to him, so he could have just popped pills in order to kill himself.
Yeah, or being a surgeon, he would have slashed his wrists rather than just stab himself in the stomach. In fact, I went out and checked the statistics for suicide, and suicide by stabbing yourself is actually very, very uncommon because of the fact that you're dealing with pain, and it will take you a while to die. So the whole thing was very suspicious, and again, as was the case with Vince Foster, rushed to judgment, it's a suicide, but again, under U.S. law and investigative procedure, all unattended deaths are presumed to be homicide until suicide is proven. And there is no proof of suicide in this case. As you said, there was no suicide note. There was no reason for this guy to kill himself. He was at the top of his game, very prestigious individual working at a prestigious hospital. He had celebrities among his various patients and clients, and life was very good. This is not a guy that you think is going to kill themselves. And again, while many of these other doctors who've died suspiciously seem tangled up with this GC MAF and Negale's controversy, this one definitely seems tied up with his open criticism of the poor performance of the Clinton Foundation, because they raised a huge amount of money supposedly for Haitian relief, and hardly any of it actually got down to Haiti. And with all this pressure to investigate the Clinton Foundation starting to build, it was only going to be a matter of time before somebody was going to interview this guy and revive the story all over again.
Yes, absolutely. So I encourage you, the audience, to check out healthnutnews.com to stay updated on these doctors who, it seems like one a week or so, are dying under suspicious circumstances.
All right, well, Chris, we're going to...
That's all I have for you.
Well, that's good, because we got to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and getting on back to computers and computer issues here. It turns out that a lot of surreptitious activity is going on involving the mining of cryptocurrencies. And we reported earlier on how certain websites were inserting Java code onto your machine so that your machine is being used to mine bitcoins for them. And it may explain why 40% of the existing bitcoins are in the hands of such a small group of people. But apparently security experts are claiming that 4 extremely popular video streaming websites have been secretly loaded with cryptocurrency mining code. And according to AdGuard, the massive mining operation was discovered when ad-blocking plugin developer was fine-tuning its ad blockers to catch and block sites that attempt to hijack web surfers' spare CPU cycles for mining. And basically, when they were analyzing the first results, they came across several very popular websites that secretly use the resources of your computers for cryptocurrency mining. And apparently, some of the sites are OpenLoad, Stream and Go, Rapid Video, Online Video Converter. And I remember Online Video Converter, that also has a reputation for planting malware on the machines as well. Meanwhile, a password-stealing app with over 1 million downloads was just discovered on the Google Play Store. And apparently, there's more than one. The most popular was a gaming app, and the app was initially submitted in March of this year. And it was just a gaming app without any malicious code, so it passed Google's inspection. But apparently, after waiting a while, the malicious actors behind the app updated it with the information stealing capacity. So the cybercrime is out of control. It's really out of control. And to me, that's a good reason to go back to a cash-based existence. Because no cyber criminal can reach into your pocket and take out those coins and paper. Of course, the bankers want to go the other way, and the European Union has just announced new restrictions on the moving of cash. They want it all in the banks. And of course, when it's in the bank's computers, again, it is wide open to being stolen, hacked into. I don't understand why our government doesn't recognize that cybercrime is a clear and present danger. to our economy, to our nation, to our people, unless the government, specifically the NSA, are the cyber criminals. And remember, Kaspersky Labs identified the Hacker Collective Equation Group as being part of the NSA. Now, apparently, Donald Trump has ordered NASA to lead a new innovative space exploration program. He wants to send American astronauts back to the moon and eventually Mars. And it sounds really good. I'd like to see it happen. I've talked before about technology incubators. But then I remember Obama made the same statement and nothing ever happened.
This is William, hopefully your favorite videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like, follow, or subscribe to us and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call.